Welcome to the YouTube channel for the HR M&A Roundtable. I'm Dr. Clint Kendrick, chair of the HR M&A Roundtable and author of the HR Practitioner's Guide to Mergers and Acquisitions Due Diligence. The HR M&A Roundtable is a forum for practitioners teaching practitioners how people, leadership, and culture drive M&A deal value. We provide a variety of opportunities for HR M&A practitioners to connect with one another, including an annual conference, webinars, a Women in HR M&A mastermind group, and of course, roundtables. I started the HR M&A Roundtable because peer learning is an invaluable resource, especially if you're new to the HR M&A space. As an experienced practitioner and HR M&A leader at a Fortune 500 company, I continue to rely on the Roundtable to stay up to date with the latest trends and thinking in HR M&A. You can learn more about the HR M&A Roundtable by visiting www.mandaroundtable.com, where you can find information on our organization and the many resources we provide for HR M&A practitioners. While you're there, sign up for our mailing list so you can stay informed about our upcoming events.
So welcome everybody to our February webinar for the HR Mergers and Acquisitions Roundtable. My name is Clint Kendrick and I'm the chair of the Roundtable, and I'm really excited to have our friends with Korn Ferry presenting on a new decade of M&A planning for the 2020s. So I'm really excited that we have three great presenters from the Korn Ferry team talking with us today. We have Mary, Alex, and Nick, who are going to be sharing their insights on the next decade of M&A. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Korn Ferry is a global organizational consulting firm that really has some fantastic capabilities that can help folks through their M&A challenges, as well as a number of other things that face organizations as we look at going into this next decade. Today, they'll be speaking to us specifically about what's going on in the world of mergers and acquisitions. So, Nick, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and we'll let you introduce yourself and start sharing with us about what to expect in this next decade of M&A.
Okay, thanks, Clint. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Franklin, Senior Client Partner at Korn Ferry. On this slide, this is just a list of our integrated solutions from a firm perspective. One of the key areas one of our integrated solutions is delivering on your M&A promises, and a key part of our business going forward. Today, I'm going to take you through a couple items in the beginning. One about what to expect from the M&A market going ahead and going forward, 2020 and beyond. Based on some information we're seeing in the marketplace. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about one of the areas that you as practitioners can control and begin to think about and bring back to your organization going forward. And then Alex and Mary from our team will talk to you a little bit about leadership and culture and M&A, which are some themes that should help benefit the items we're about to talk about. Okay, next slide. So what will the world look like during the 2020s? Based on various studies from PwC, EY, Intralinks, and other organizations in the marketplace, there's three items you can read here that are coming to fruition. For the marketplace in 2020, I would want to mention that deal volume is expected to be higher than normal than 2019 going forward. That's even with some concerns about the marketplace. That's even with concerns about it's a presidential election year. That's even with concerns about tariffs between countries. And I wanted to point out on that point of tariffs, I mean, that's probably one of the reasons companies need to actually do more deals and transform their business on this point, because tariffs will possibly require you to change your supply chain model going forward, possibly change your sales model going forward. And what better way to do that than through acquisitions going forward. As you can see, a lot of companies are talking about how to upscale their technology and talent. We are already seeing that in various companies. I have clients that are eager and looking at targets to acquire different technology capabilities in people, different software and hardware. You have other industries that are seeking to get ahead by buying new IP and new assets for their business going forward. These concerns about and a lot of these points here, as you can read, are primarily driven by businesses seeking to get ahead, not falling behind, not wanting to become that business that becomes obsolete in the future. And so all these businesses, from the surveys we've seen and the information we received, are looking to do M&As to move forward in these areas. The third point about talent is really did come through in some of the surveys pretty broadly and pretty loudly. And these are topics that I think most of your companies are talking about today. I know our company is talking about it with regards to being inclusive, diverse, and working on that talent shortage going forward. So on the next slide, one of the things I wanted to talk about was how can you, as practitioners, prepare yourself for a transaction, and how can you accelerate your deal? Because given the points on the prior page, everything you heard was transformative, everything you heard was moving faster, everything you heard was don't fall behind. Well, speed, right, is one of those things that we need to accomplish within transactions. So there's 4 items I have listed here, and I'm going to give you an example on a couple of these. So on the point of create a strategy to negotiate, what I'm talking about here is I had clients that we worked with them on their negotiation strategy in diligence and in that pre-sign phase. What we did is we took the purchase agreement, we ripped out all the employee matters negotiation points, and helped create options for the organization, go through scenario planning. If the organization we're looking to purchase wants X, what are 3, negotiation strategies for that option? How many years are we willing to make employees whole? If we're selling the business, how do we protect our employees, and how do we create those strategies that help us not have stranded costs when we're selling an organization? So we work with organizations to work through point by point on how to manage each situation, whether they're selling or buying a company, so that they're well prepared when they're negotiating a transaction. On this point of determine how to be flexible, it kind of falls into that topic of strategy. What I'm getting at there is try to be the group that can make the deal happen no matter what. Understand that, your organization may have a philosophy on a certain employee point that, we're not gonna pay for severance, right, in a deal where we're selling our employees. You may have to give on that point sometimes. And so what I'm getting at here is understand how to be flexible, understand what the cost is of that, possibly that give, and be able to manage it, because not every deal is the same. Sometimes you have to give and take on certain points throughout the transaction. So even though a people matter may be a give for your organization in an M&A, there's probably some business points that you're winning. Again, they don't affect you as HR practitioners or other types of practitioners in the people area, but from a business perspective, you may be winning on other points, and that was the trade. So unfortunately, sometimes we'll have to accept certain terms that we don't necessarily believe in, but it was done for the greater good of getting something else in return in the transaction. So the other point on perform talent pre-close, this is a big one. I believe This is the area a lot of companies don't tend to get to this point early on. I think in order to accelerate deals moving forward, this is one area that all of us will have to work on with our teams, with our opportunities, our acquisitions, our sales. Because the better you know your talent, the better you know what you're buying or you're selling and you're receiving. Alex and Mary are going to talk about leadership and culture and how they support M&A transactions. And I think there are two important areas that will sort of upheld and kind of give you a way to look at these points that I'm talking about now. So I want to pause and take a moment for questions. I think this is where we're at, Clint, and if there's anything in the chat box I need to answer, let me know.
Great. And folks who have questions can either take themselves off mute or they can put it into the chat box. So, Nick, I've got one question here, and I apologize, folks. I'm getting a bad echo, so I'm going to go ahead and mute all the lines again. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and put those into the chat box. That's how I think we're going to have to manage around the background noise today. Nick, the first question that I have in the chat box, you had mentioned the need to do the talent work sooner in a deal so that we could make the deal happen faster. As you look at the work that we do in a deal, are there other ways that we can add value beyond speed? And I think, Nick, I may have, there we go, I need to unmute you. There we go.
I'm unmuted, okay. So, yes, there are other ways we can add value other than speed, right? And then, so a couple examples. Typically, transactions have cost synergies associated with them. What does that mean from an HR side? Maybe there's opportunities to align your benefit and compensation costs and find opportunities there. An organization way is quickly move to better spans and layers of your organization going forward and your org design. Try to find that optimal operating model for you going forward as fast as you can. But the theme there is capturing costs and savings for the organization going forward. There are revenue synergies opportunities as well. These tend to be harder to get at, but how can we work on that? I would say if you're buying an organization and you're looking to combine sales organizations, look at your sales commission plan, your bonus scheme. Get those metrics right as fast as possible, because the faster you generate combined revenue as an organization, the faster you get to value. How's that?
That's great, Nick. Okay. So the next question we have is, most of the M&As that we do are very fast-paced between due diligence and signing.
Right.
What kind of talent work can be done with the limited access?
Good question, and this is the one I would challenge folks to think differently about, and you can do a lot, actually. The concerns, so let me bring up the concerns, right? Usually the typical concerns are data privacy, no access to the folks, and I understand that. I've done that. The ways to work around it. Quite honestly, ask for it. Ask for access. I think sometimes clients and buyers don't want to ask for it. Ask for access. Tell them exactly. Get some interviews done. You should feel okay to get assessments done. You should think about clean rooms and beginning that org design process, operating model work as soon as you can. There are, and I would just stress that, again, I know people are probably saying, that's really hard to do sometimes. I get it. There's ways to negotiate to get there. And I would stress that's how you're going to get there, is negotiating and pushing to get there earlier than later. And like I said, maybe it's just the leaders, right? Maybe at least you get your access to your top leaders, and you begin to learn about them and assess them and take some time to see if they actually would be a fit and do they want to work for you going forward.
Great. So Nick, the next question we have is, how helpful are playbooks in accelerating the process?
Good question. So playbooks are helpful, and I don't always like the word playbook. I tend to tell clients, framework. And what I mean by that, a playbook, and I've developed them. They're heavy, they're big, they sometimes tend to be one-minded, one way. What I'd like to see clients and teams do, and buyers do, and sellers do, is create a framework or create for yourself some optionality. So maybe it is a playbook, maybe it's not, but the idea is just accept you will have to deviate from that maybe the perfect way you want to do that deal, and understand your limitations of doing that. So I understand. I had a client that 100% said, Nick, we cannot do TSAs. Okay, we can't deliver on them. We're terrible at it. Our systems stink. We can't do it. So no matter what in this deal, we cannot negotiate for a TSA, right? That's okay, but at least you know that going in. But you then need to realize you're going to give something up for it. If you want to get the deal done, you're going to give something up for it. If you want to get, because that buyer or that seller is going to want a TSA sometimes to allow themselves to get where they need to get to. So just, again, have a framework, have some optionality to whatever your plan is. And I was back to my point about being flexible. Just understand that, you will have to give and take on some of that.
Great. And Nick, we have one more question
Sure.
on the general state of the industry, and then I've actually got a few more, but they're, I think, a little bit more about leadership. So I'm going to save these for Alex's section next, where we'll be talking about leadership a little more specifically. But the general question is, with deals on the rise, do you see a specific industry or sector rising more than others?
So the industry I think that truly needs to move forward faster is industrials, companies in oil and gas. They tend to be organizations, and what I mean by that is when you saw the point on talent and technology, those are the industries that tend to be lagging in those two areas. And they need an upgrade, and they need an upgrade fast to survive. They need an upgrade fast to get to the profitability they're seeking. And quite frankly, they need it to be attractive to our younger, talented folks that are coming into the market today. I've had many conversations with industrial, chemical, agrochemical companies about how they change the way they're seen by college students and undergrads, and how do they become, like the new best thing for them to come to, and how do I attract better engineers, and how do I attract, get students to want to be engineers, quite frankly, and join their organization.
Great. Well, thanks, Nick, and I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Alex now.
Thanks, Clint. So, Alex Jakobson, I lead our mergers and acquisitions solution area. I've been with the firm for 3 years. We have 500 consultants around the globe with deep M&A experience, but they're really leveraging the sort of 7,500 human capital consultants that sit in Korn Ferry's different solution areas. I have the privilege and the honor to be involved in that process. I've sold 3 companies that belong to me, and I've also led the integration of 3 companies when I was in a corporate role, and then obviously being here at Korn Ferry with the role that I have, I have the opportunity to be involved in many deals, more than I'd like to share. But it gives me what I believe a unique perspective of what it's like selling something that you created, what it's like being in the pressures of being in an executive position when you're trying to integrate businesses, And then, of course, being on the consulting side, where you are a strategic advisor and sometimes the arms and the legs of your client. And so what I wanted to talk about during my session was truly the role of leadership, and how do you use a transaction to help build the strength of your leadership pipeline and make sure that you can accelerate and drive business results in what most of us who've been involved in transactions find a moment where there's a lot of disruption and can be a lot of ambiguity about the way the organization is going to be run moving forward. And what I wanted to do is just share, before I go into details, some of the latest research that Korn Ferry's done on the future of talent. You know, we're at 2020. If you recall, a few years back, many people were setting their 2020 vision. We're there right now. And certainly I think the way that the global marketplace has been changing, what Nick said in his section, has had really vast implications on the world of talent. And we're seeing more and more acquisitions being driven because of a lack of talent and the desire to build new capabilities. So Clint, if you go to the next slide, I just want to highlight the aspect of executive level leadership from this report. The report is identifying that a different style of leadership is being required in the world today, moving away from one that's highly controlling, hierarchical, and directive, to one that's more purpose-driven, flatter organizations with individuals that can lead through ambiguity, develop people, and build networks internally and externally. So what does that mean from a acquisition, or a divestiture, a bolt-on, whatever transaction that you might be dealing with? So Clint, if you could go to the next slide. Korn Ferry's point of view is that value in transactions is 90% driven by the talent involved in those transactions. And as you know, most of the time when we're identifying targets to pursue, we're often not looking at it initially through the talent lens. More often than not, we look at it through the lens of financials and assets, global footprints, manufacturing or product capability, and so forth. And talent is sometimes an afterthought. So why is that, and why should that change? Well, we believe that in order to drive value in a transaction, you're going to need to start to look at three things. One, what are the new capabilities that are required to drive a deal value? So there was a client that we've been working with recently where there's a merger of equals, and overnight many of the roles are doubling. Some of the roles are tripling in complexity, scope, and accountability. And the client recognizes that the capabilities collectively and individually of the top four levels in the organization are going to significantly change. Their accountabilities are going to need to change because the strategy's changed. They're moving into new markets. They're changing their supply chain. So therefore, how do you set those new capabilities, and how do you know if you've got the talent to be able to deliver on those? And then finally, with this case, with a merger of equals, but in pretty much any transaction, culture is always critical. Whether you're doing an acqui-hire and you're buying talent that comes with digital capability, you're going to want them to stay. And that's not always an easy predictor of whether they will or not, unless you can understand the DNA of those leaders and see whether they would flourish or not in the culture that you have as an organization. Not only that, furthermore, the leaders you put in place at the top level will end up setting the accountabilities. They'll end up setting what capabilities are required, and they'll end up modeling the culture further down in the organization. So just to summarize, what's up there on the vertical axis, which is business outcomes, in our view, is really talking about the results of leadership. The cause of those business outcomes, in our view, is the leaders that you select. So the question becomes, well, how do you select the leaders? So if you go to the next slide, how do you get alignment in the organization? We have clients that come to us and they say, when should we start leadership assessment? Or we're not sure we can really start leadership selection because we don't know what the new organizational structure and operating model and organizational design is going to be. So the question becomes, how do you know what good looks like if you haven't got all the answers in terms of the structure and org design? Well, again, our point of view is part of getting alignment on what the future should look like and what leaders are going to be able to match up to the deal thesis is firstly starting with a success profile. And a success profile is reasonably high level. It looks at two core buckets of information. One is information from you, the acquiring and acquired company. So what's the deal strategy? What's been the past strategy? What areas of the business are likely to integrate mostly? Which ones are not? What are some critical roles that are going to drive value in the deal thesis? And so we work with clients to figure that out. And then the other bucket is information that Korn Ferry brings from its benchmarking and the vast data that we have in our assessments organization. We've done 69 million assessments, and we really do know what good looks like. So we bring science and data with strategy and client information, and we combine those to identify what great leadership looks like at an enterprise level based on the accountabilities, the skills, and the culture that you're going to want to create moving forward. So with that success profile, we get alignment from the board, the CEO, the CFO, the CHROs, and some key executives. And then we go about assessing people on both sides of the deal. So particularly in a merger of equal, although not in every case, sometimes we'll be, a client will be doing a bolt-on, and there we'll be purely assessing the talent within the target company, so that we can help inform how best they might integrate and who's driving real value in that target company and how difficult it might be to replace them. So if you go to the next slide, what you see here is more of a sort of tactical view. So you imagine that you might be looking at the top 4 levels in an organization to assess. Here we have an example of a level 3 candidates in a particular role in major projects. And these are candidates from, made up, obviously, but an example of candidates that would be from both organizations. And they would have gone through an assessment process that would involve what we call a market assessment, which is an interview from a search consultant that has deep expertise in that industry and function. Secondly, they'll be interviewed by an org psychologist who has deep expertise in understanding leadership competencies. And thirdly, they would have taken an online psychometric assessment, which has been created by Korn Ferry's science and data and IP. And those are combined to create reports. And what you see here are just thumbnails of the candidates, which provides the decisioning committee. So, for example, we would facilitate meetings with the CEO so that the CEO can figure out who should be her direct reports. We would facilitate this with each of the functional and business unit leaders so they too could understand their direct reports. And then we would cascade that process through down to level 4, for example, in the example that I was giving you earlier on. So the question might come, what are you assessing for? So Clint, if you could move to the next slide. Korn Ferry has an approach that assesses for 4 different areas. And really clients are coming to us trying to figure this out. So obviously the first area, they want to know who are great performers, who are star performers in the 2 organizations or the target organization. And that's usually based on past performance. And, how effectively would they be able to lead in the new organization? So there's some questions that come up there is just because someone's been a great star in the old organization, does that necessarily follow that they'll be a great star producer in the new organization? And of course, the answer is no, because their role may change and the scope of it and what they're asked to do and how the new business operates. So we help answer those questions so that you can identify the really strong, I don't know, for lack of a better term, water carriers, and will they continue to be really, really strong performers moving forward? The other question that clients ask is who's ready for a new role that's slightly bigger now? Because in most transactions, roles do increase in size. And so who could close that gap immediately now or very quickly after the deal closes? The third one is who's got potential? And so Korn Ferry has a very strong insights as to learning agility, and we have a learning agility model. It doesn't just answer the question of who's a quick learner, but it answers questions like who can deal with change, who has good people agility, who has good strategic thinking agility, who's resourceful with how to get results. So it's a really holistic look at agility and is proven to be one of the key indicators of executive success and progression. So you're able to identify who could take a larger role, who, if you've not got anyone with the experience for the larger role, is most likely to succeed if you drop them in the deep end. But then importantly, who are your high potentials from both organizations? And we often recommend, particularly in mergers of equals or where there's a merger in a business unit where there's a lot of integration, that you assess both your current talent that exists in the company that's acquiring and the talent that you buy. And then finally, who's fit and ready now in a role to take the business forward? Who's the right candidate, both from a skills, experience, but also cultural perspective. So it really is a holistic view to making those selections, and we believe is kind of the number one most important thing that you'll do in a transaction. So I'll stop there, Clint. I know you want to open up for questions.
Yeah, and actually we've already got a few in the chat box, so if folks have other questions, please feel free to send them my way. Alex, I'm going to try to break these into assessment questions and integration questions. Though as questions come in, of course, I'll need to break from that. But one of the questions we've got is, do you have any tools, recommendations, or suggestions when the seller and the buyer are defining hypos differently?
That's such a great question. And one of the key benefits of looking to a third party to help you figure that how to assess for potential. And the reason for that is, of course, different organizations have different cultures. They run their business differently. So therefore, they look at accountability capabilities and culture in a different way. So it's critically important that when the terminology they're using to label talent is understood both sides, because as we know, the words that we use have different meanings depending on who receives the words, and that's never more so when you're starting to do talent assessment. The other thing is to level set between the two organizations, and by using perhaps a new approach across both organizations that builds on the way you're doing talent assessment and management today, gives you the opportunity to make sure that you're assessing on the same criteria, plus every participant who gets an assessment has an equal chance of, they're playing on the level playing field. They have an equal chance to show their strengths and be selected. Often candidates come to us and very anxious about their future, and they don't know necessarily the new leaders in the organization, and they're worried that it might not be fair, and that causes people to start to look outside very quickly, and you have dangers of losing your best talent. So great question there.
Great. So Alex, I've got a couple of questions about timing that I'm going to sort of mush together here. So when should you do leadership assessments in a typical M&A? And with that, given regulations about information sharing and data privacy, some companies are hesitant to do the assessments prior to close. So can you address generally when we should be looking at assessment, and similar to the question Nick answered about privacy concerns, whether we should be looking at doing those before close?
Yeah, great question. So I'll break that down. So the when, best practice is that you should be looking at assessments the minute you know that you've announced a deal. In fact, really, assessments is happening even prior to announcing the deal in some of the conversations that are happening at the executive level. But the minute the deal's announced, you should be thinking about how you're going to do assessments. You should be best practice would recommend put an RFP out and get assessment companies, consulting firms to come and present so you can learn best practices from the market and plan for it. The second part of the question was the data privacy thing, and can you do assessments prior to closing? So there's certainly employee data that absolutely you shouldn't share and should not be part of an assessment prior to a deal, and you should always seek your legal counsel on what can and can't be shared. But when it relates to interviewing and assessing leaders and interviewing them for whether they're right for a role, that's absolutely allowed and common best practice prior to closing. And in fact, many research, and including research that Korn Ferry's done, but there's lots of research done on what are predictors of success in deals. And certainly clients, organizations that announce leaders early on in a transaction, and that's typically at day one, are 4 times more likely to achieve their deal objectives. So, there's the history shows that being able to make those selections early, it really helps you drive success for obvious reasons, like, removing ambiguity of who's going to lead and how decisions are made, speeding up integration and so forth.
Great. So I'm going to move to a couple of questions we've had on integration now, Alex. The first one is about aligning titles. So do you have any tips or ideas about alignment of top management titles when folks are coming in through an acquisition?
Yeah, this is a very emotional question. People, including myself, tie a lot of emotion and measuring your own progress on what your title is and what your role is. So very important. The organizations will often have different titling. Job leveling is really important. You should embark on and it's very typical for particularly in the compensation side, for job leveling and titling to be a work stream. And it's something that's really important when you're looking to integrate talent, not just for the emotional, am I going to be a SVP or an EVP, but also for you to identify does an EVP from one side of the organization equal to an EVP on the other side of the organization based on the accountabilities and skills and experiences that are required. So combining that with your org design and your assessment is a good idea.
Right. And Alex, the last question we have that's integration related, and I don't know if this is more in line with your thoughts on leadership or Mary's thoughts on culture, which we'll cover in a few moments. But where in the integration process would you do the strategic visioning exercises?
So strategic visioning should happen as early on in the process as possible. However, good strategic alignment and visioning should be something that continues prior to the deal closing and continues post deal closing. And certainly I would recommend in the first 2 years of a transaction if it's a large integration, because really your ability to know that strategy is being executed is about a continual flow of decisions being made at every level in the organization. And how can people make the right decisions at every level if they aren't part of that visioning process?
Great.
Mary's probably got more to say than me on that when it comes to culture.
Well, that's probably a perfect segue. So, Mary, why don't we go ahead and turn it over to you?
Great. Thank you, Clint. And Nick mentioned that Deals of the Future will focus on both technology and talent acquisition. So understanding the changing dynamics of the talent landscape is critical to driving deal value. For example, how do we engage talent for the short term, knowing that many of these career nomads may have their eye on the next hop to a new job? The timeline is changing to 2 years for millennials to stay with one position. How do we keep talent that have the skills already in short supply in our companies? So one of our future thinking clients recognized that while they needed to let go thousands of people to achieve their synergy targets, they were also hiring thousands of people in other parts of the organization to bring in the new digital skills they needed while embarking on the reskilling process of their own. This led to an internal career mobility center for the merger so that they made sure the skills they needed did not walk out the door. On the same hand, on the next slide, as Nick mentioned earlier as well, we know that the impact diversity and inclusion is having on our workplace. Many of our clients are looking at their leadership selection processes through the D&I lens to ensure that they maintain the achievements of the past while continuing to gain ground for the future. And the fact that we now have 5 generations in the workplace creates new challenges for creating inclusive cultures. So how do we think about cultural integration? It's important in terms of not ignoring the demographics of both the acquired talent and the talent we have. Yet, we often still lack a true understanding of the importance of culture in delivering on deal value. So I wonder if you've ever read in a press release 2 CEOs saying, "We have vastly different cultures, and we don't have the foggiest idea of how things get done in the other company." Probably not. What we do read is our cultures are compatible, blah, 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 which really means our values are similar. We care about our customers. We care about the environment. We operate with respect and integrity. And we, as the 2 CEOs who inked this deal, really like each other. All wonderful things, but not what we mean by culture. So if we move to the next slide, the focus on technology and talent acquisition requires us to think differently about how we approach the culture question. No longer can we assume the approach used by most serial acquirers in the past. Assess the target's culture, compare it to ours, develop a change plan so that the acquired talent looks and acts like we do. Today we have to take a deeper look at why we did the deal in the first place, the decisions we need to make that will have an impact on culture, and the most important aspects of culture we need to deeply understand so we don't mess things up. For one life science outsource provider, the acquired company had a commercial function that did not exist in the buyer. So the deal rationale was one of both scale and scope. They now had more to sell to their customers, but in a very different line of business. They needed to understand what made that commercial function tick, and because that was going to be most important, and understanding the decisions that were being made in a highly decentralized part of the company. Being able to drill down into the decision-making process, how it affected customers, and most importantly, how it affected the creative talent in that commercial organization who delivered the services became a focal area of discovery. So it's identifying what's most important to truly understand and making sure we do a deep dive into those aspects of culture. We don't need to boil the ocean when trying to understand the culture, but you do need to know what are those things that will have a material impact on a successful integration. So as we look at culture, what do we need to know? Our next slide shows the model of how we think about culture in Korn Ferry. It reflects the dimensions of culture that our research shows influences organizational effectiveness. The tool and the model differentiates what we know about companies in different industries. For example, fast-moving companies, such as high-tech companies, show a stronger preference for customers, focus on competitors, and risk tolerance, while slower-moving companies tend to show preferences for operational efficiency. It also captures what we often see as national cultural differences, as defined by Hofstede, related to power distance, collaboration, risk tolerance, and long-term horizon. So when we think about understanding culture from a global perspective, we often see when we use culture tools that findings may be more reflective of national culture, but we need to think about it with caution. For one biopharma company, the findings are striking in the way that EMEA differed from other regions in the world. On the surface, this may have led us to believe that it was a national nuance. But in digging deeper, what we realized is it reflected the fact that in EMEA, the company had grown through acquisitions with little to no integration. So the story, in fact, was a more muddled one than initially expected, which points to the need to use a multi-method approach as outlined on our next slide. In order to truly understand culture and to define the new culture, we need to gather data from multiple sources. Through data available on the internet, we can get early insights even during the due diligence stage into culture. We've used tools that look at Glassdoor insights and data and using algorithms to provide an initial picture of how companies are similar or different. While early Glassdoor data was often suspect, we have found over time that it does have face validity with clients, and it's a start. We often find, too, as well, that data available in the data room can help us to point some initial hypotheses about culture. In one insurance company that was buying a digital organization, what that digital company had posted on the deal site was information about their HR policies and practices in their handbook, which was, in fact, that there was no HR policy or practice. They had no HR function. They had no vacation day limit. Everyone was termed a people manager. And they made a point in their information that they shared with the buyer that it was very much a culture of trust, high degree of trust in the organization where they trusted that people would do the right thing with little regard for formal or written policies. So even during the due diligence stage, this insurance company was starting to paint a picture of what that culture may be like, but recognizing that additional data was going to be needed. Executive interviews are a fascinating portal into the leadership mindset of each company and an important part of the discovery process. For one energy company, I was struck by the fact that each leader in the acquired company used the phrase, "What our leader finds interesting, we find fascinating." The managing of culture and the lack of proactive accountability proved to be a major change challenge as they look to become a more innovative culture in fast-moving organization. And yet executives don't always have the complete story of how their employees experience culture. For a Midwest insurance company merging with an East Coast one, there was quite a surprise for the East Coast CEO when we used a survey and focus groups. He believed that the Midwest company, which is highly centralized, was going to come out very low on factors such as empowerment, and publicly stated that to the Midwest CEO. To his surprise, the survey was quite the opposite. The Midwest company had high scores on empowerment and accountability and so forth. What we learned from the focus groups was that within the East Coast company below the VP level, the ways of managing were very different. And the CEO's reality and what he experienced with his direct reports was not filtering down. Now, of course, he blamed the survey team and its lack of validity, but the focus group data was hard to ignore. So one final note about culture. In our experience, engaging leaders in defining the new culture can be a pivotal moment in creating leadership alignment and a common purpose across the leadership team. For a big pharma company, it was the primary vehicle they used to not only integrate the two organizations, but to shift their strategic intent to be more like a specialty pharma company. Spending 3 days addressing the desired culture, getting down into the details of expected behaviors for each part of the business, from R&D, commercial, to the functions, embracing their roles as leaders of change, was believed to be a defining moment that led to the highest gains in leadership engagement scores they'd ever experienced, but more importantly, the return on shareholder value that was received. So Clint, I can open this up for questions at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a couple of questions that have come in already, and if you have more, please go ahead and put them into the chat box. So Mary, the first question is, you shared an example about the HR handbooks in the data room. Are there any other areas where you might look in the data room for culture examples that may not be in the HR section?
Sure. I mean, I think anything that you can find out about processes and accountabilities would be helpful. And oftentimes we look into, financial levels of authority if that information is available, because that will give you some insights into the sense of empowerment. I remember working with one company where they were trying to become more agile and decisive, and the manager said to us, this was during the focus group process, how can we be agile and more decisive when, saying this tongue in cheek, we have to get 5 levels of approval to be able to take our team to lunch. So I think what you try to do is look at what insights can you gather about policies, what insights can you gather about areas that we know are critical in decision making, communications, how are communications delivered. And certainly I think the deal team, through their interactions, through the management presentations, have a great deal of insight into how things are done.
Great. The next question that we have is about, really how much can we trust some of the information that's shared during the diligence process? Both the data room, executive interviews, this individual is even seeing Glassdoor information being changed to put a more positive spin on the selling company's culture. How do you filter for that?
Yeah, I mean, the intent, right, is to sell at the best price, so you're only going to be putting forward the pretty parts of your culture picture. And that's why we really believe that you need to look at a lot of different data sources in terms of painting the culture and getting those insights, that it has to be viewed speculative. I think what you try to do is what we might call in research triangulate. So what are the common themes that keep coming up? Where do you see the inconsistencies in the data that's being presented? How can you validate that with external information that might be available? Oftentimes we see folks talking to people who might have come from that other company, right, to see what their experience was like. Or is there customer data that, again, is publicly available? So I think you have to look at where do you find the inconsistencies and where do you find the consistencies in building out those themes, and recognize that at that stage, you really are just developing hypotheses for testing.
Great. And I think we have time for probably 1 or 2 more questions. So I've got another one here for you, but if anybody else has one that they'd like to put in the chat box, feel free to do that. So Mary, how does culture assessment and integration look different based on the type of integration?
Yeah, Clint, this used to be a simple question to answer because, when I started doing this work and we were talking about an acquisition, it was basically about how do we bring the acquired company into our footprint and our ways of doing things. And now we're looking at, even with acquisition, companies are looking at the capabilities of that target company and the cultural elements that they can leverage. So you think about big pharma buying biotech, or big high tech buying startup companies, that they're wanting to gather those capabilities and not destroy the value by dramatically changing the culture. So I think the acquisition, it can look one of two ways, right? Like a serial acquirer, where it's really more of a change management process than a culture integration process. And then when you're doing smaller deals, really understand how do you protect that culture within the confines of the organization. In a merger of equals, and Alex shared an example earlier, even in that case, it's not necessarily best of both, but a lot of these deals, and particularly if they're scope deals, are being done for transformational purposes. So it's keeping in mind what the deal value drivers are, the capabilities that you're acquiring, and then thinking about what the best cultural approach might be. I'm also starting to think about that the terms cultural integration and cultural harmonization are becoming outdated. I mean, you think about diversity and inclusion in the workforce. It's really, how do we help people align around a common sense of purpose, and recognizing that while there's always some non-negotiables, it may not be in our best interest to try to integrate or harmonize from a cultural perspective.
Great. So I've got one last question that's just come in, and this is a bit of a chance for a cage match between Alex and Mary. So the question is, what's more important to deal success? Understanding the culture factors or understanding the leader factors?
I'll take a first pass at that, and you need to know, Alex and I are sitting in the same room, so this could become a fist fight. But we would say one of the things that we think is unique about our approach to culture is that understanding the leadership mindset is a critical aspect of understanding culture and the beliefs that leaders have about what drives value. So we would say that they're equally important. And in fact, leadership assessments plus cultural assessments would be the right way to go.
Great. Well, so I think we may have avoided the fist fight there, Mary. Great. Well, so we're almost at time, and I want to thank you, you and Alex and Nick, for providing this information. Thank you to everybody who joined us for the great questions, and I really appreciate the insight that gives.
Thank you for watching this presentation by the HR M&A Roundtable. Please subscribe to our channel so you can be the first to learn when we add new content that will help you in your M&A journey. And be sure to join our mailing list by visiting www.mandaroundtable.com.